We've all heard the story of creation in the Bible. God spoke and the universe came into being. Simple, right? But what if I told you that Genesis isn't the original creation story? That's right, the biblical story of creation is actually not the first of its kind. Far from it. There's an older, more ancient myth that predates it by centuries, and it comes from none other than Babylon. Around the 18th century BCE, there was a myth circulating in the ancient city of Babylon called Enuma Elish. This isn't just some obscure bedtime story. Enuma Elish was the backbone of Babylonian religious thought, shaping their worldview for centuries. It tells the tale of how the universe came to be, starting with a dark, watery chaos, the primordial state of existence. Sound familiar already? The stars of this epic aren't the familiar figures from Genesis. Instead, we've got gods like Tiamat, a dragon-like figure representing the chaotic waters, and Marduk, the hero of the story, who rises to battle this primordial chaos. And here's the kicker. After slaying Tiamat, Marduk takes her body and carves the world from it. Creation from chaos, from the dismembered body of a god. Now pause for a second. Genesis 1 verse 2 talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. There's no mention of a cosmic battle, but the image of God shaping order from chaos sound a bit too close to Babylonian myths for comfort. We're starting to see the parallels, and it gets even more intriguing. But why does this matter? Because Enuma Elish is older. Babylon was thriving long before the biblical texts were written. By the time the Israelites found themselves exiled in Babylon, they were surrounded by this myth. And during this exile, their own creation stories were being written down and compiled, Genesis included. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. We're talking about a story, Genesis, that shaped billions of lives, possibly borrowing ideas from an even older story that almost no one talks about today. Did the authors of Genesis reworked Babylonian myth to fit their vision of God? It's not just possible, it's likely. And that turns everything we thought we knew upside down. The waters of chaos, the ordering of the cosmos, the act of creation itself, these aren't just themes exclusive to the Bible. They're shared across cultures, across time. And the fact that Genesis echoes Enuma Elish suggests something bigger. The Bible isn't as isolated or out of nowhere as many people assume. It's part of a much older, much more complicated story, and when you peel back those layers, you start to wonder, if Genesis wasn't the first creation story, what does that say about the text? What does that say about how it was written and why? All right, we're not just talking about some casual similarity here. This isn't just a shared chaos to order theme between Genesis and Enuma Elish. The real question is, did the Bible actually plagiarize Babylonian mythology? In Enuma Elish, creation doesn't come from nothing. It begins with chaos, Tiamat, the mother of all gods, who embodies this chaotic oceanic abyss. Marduk doesn't just snap his fingers to bring order, he dismembers her, creating the heavens and the earth from her body parts. This isn't some poetic metaphor, it's brutal, cosmic violence that births creation. The divine and the material are literally fused together in Babylonian thought. So when the biblical writers describe God hovering over the deep, that's a concept loaded with ancient mythological baggage. It's not a neutral phrase. Now, Genesis presents this image of a formless, empty earth covered by water, a shadow of the chaotic abyss in Enuma Elish. Genesis removes the violence. There's no Marduk, no Tiamat, no divine blood. Instead, we see a God who simply speaks, and order emerges. This shift isn't just theological, it's political. It reflects an intentional rewriting of the mythological template that dominated the ancient Near East. The Bible is sanitizing and rebranding ancient ideas to fit a new, monotheistic worldview. And this is where things get uncomfortable. We know Enuma Elish was part of Babylonian religious practice for centuries before Genesis was written. The Israelites were exiled in Babylon, living among these stories, hearing them, and absorbing their cultural influence. It's during this exile that many scholars believe the Genesis account was either written or significantly edited. So what are we looking at here? A case of creative reinterpretation or straight-up cultural theft? Why would the Hebrew writers want to reframe a myth that wasn't their own? It comes down to control, both theological and cultural. By stripping away the polytheism and violence from the creation myth, the biblical authors present a God who is not only all-powerful, but unchallenged. Genesis isn't just telling us how the world began. It's telling us how to understand authority, order, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. In the Babylonian version, the gods fight amongst themselves, and humans are created to be slaves. In Genesis, God is calm, calculated, and humans are made in the image of God, with a unique status in creation. This reinterpretation didn't happen in a vacuum. Genesis is doing something bigger. It's redefining what creation even means. The ancient world saw creation as this raw, often violent struggle to impose order on chaos. Genesis takes that chaos, neutralizes it, and says, no, our God doesn't need to fight. It's a theological power move, asserting the supremacy of one God over all others, rejecting the messiness of divine conflict in favor of divine sovereignty. In doing so, Genesis presents not just a different creation story, but a challenge to the surrounding myths that existed for millennia. So, what does this mean for the integrity of the biblical text? This isn't just a question of cultural borrowing, it's about ideological dominance. Genesis reshapes the myth in a way that fits the political and religious needs of a people trying to distinguish themselves from their Babylonian captors. But in doing so, it leaves us with a complex question. Is Genesis truly unique, or is it a refined copy designed to overwrite older, inconvenient truths? Across the ancient Near East, creation wasn't just about bringing order from chaos, it was about battling chaos. And while Genesis might soften that narrative, Enuma Elish leans into it hard. We're talking about gods literally at war, tearing each other apart to build the universe. In the Babylonian version, the hero god Marduk goes toe-to-toe with Tiamat, the monstrous embodiment of the chaotic seas. And this isn't just some polite disagreement. Marduk splits her body in two like a cosmic butcher, fashioning the heavens and the earth from her remains. In Babylonian myth, the world doesn't come about by divine whispering, it's born out of blood and guts. That's creation. Babylonian style. Brutal. Violent. And undeniably epic. Now compare that to the Bible's take. God doesn't fight anyone. He just is. Chaos? It's there in Genesis, but instead of slaying it, God speaks it into submission. Let there be light, and boom, chaos is tamed. No fight, no struggle, just power and control. But here's where it gets juicy. While the Bible downplays the violence, there are still echoes of this ancient cosmic battle. In the book of Psalms and Isaiah, you'll find these cryptic references to Yahweh doing battle with sea monsters like Leviathan or Rariab, symbolic figures of chaos. These are holdovers from an older tradition where God doesn't just hover over the waters, he conquers them. It's a snapshot of a world where chaos isn't just abstract, it's an actual opponent, something to be defeated. The Genesis account might erase the fight, but traces of that struggle survive in these scattered verses, hinting that there's more to the story than a peaceful God shaping the universe with words alone. Here's the kicker. These battles aren't just ancient mythology, they're power plays. In Babylon, Marduk's victory over Tiamat wasn't just a cool story, it was propaganda, reinforcing Marduk's supreme position over the other gods and justifying Babylon's dominance. Genesis, on the other hand, flips the script, no need for a battle, because Yahweh's power is uncontested. The biblical authors are making a clear statement here. Our God doesn't need to fight for control, he already has it. But let's not miss the tension lurking beneath this. If Yahweh is so all-powerful, why do the Psalms and Isaiah refer to these ancient battles with chaos monsters? Why does the imagery of a cosmic fight still slip through the cracks? Some scholars suggest it's because the Hebrew Bible is preserving fragments of an older, more chaotic tradition where God had to prove his might, just like Marduk. These remnants suggest a shared origin, an older story where creation wasn't so peaceful after all. The Bible's rewriting of the creation story feels deliberate, an attempt to strip away the violence and chaos that defined earlier myths. But the fact that these chaotic elements still surface in other parts of Scripture points to something deeper. The ancient Israelites were surrounded by cultures that told stories of gods battling for control over the universe, and those stories left their mark. Genesis might present a cleaned-up version of events, but it's impossible to ignore the chaotic undercurrents. Here's something most people don't realize. Creation in the Bible wasn't a solo project. Genesis 1 verse 26 has God saying, "Let us make man in our image." Wait, who's us? Who's God talking to? Is this a slip-up, or is there something more going on here? Now, if you've been raised on the idea of one God doing it all, this should raise some serious eyebrows. But here's the thing. This whole idea of a divine council isn't unique to the Bible. In fact, it's a common thread running through the ancient world, and Enuma Elish is a prime example of this. In the Babylonian myth, Marduk doesn't just declare himself ruler of the cosmos out of nowhere. He earns his position after being appointed by a council of gods. His victory over Tiamat is approved, sanctioned, and then rewarded with the ultimate authority. The gods gather, debate, and decide who's in charge. Creation is a team effort with divine politics at play. Now, take that back to Genesis. We've been taught that there's only one God in the Hebrew Bible, right? But here we've got God talking in the plural. Let us make man in our image. And this isn't the only place in the Bible where the concept of a divine council shows up. Psalm 82, for example, talks about God standing in the assembly of gods, passing judgment on them. It's clear that, at least in some parts of the Bible, there's this idea of multiple divine beings involved in the process of creation and ruling the world. This isn't just monotheism as we understand it today. So what's really going on here? One theory is that these remnants of a divine council are leftovers from earlier polytheistic traditions. Before the Israelites fully embraced monotheism, they, like their Babylonian neighbors, likely believed in a host of divine beings. Over time, the biblical texts evolved, the gods were downplayed, and Yahweh took center stage. But echoes of that older worldview remain, slipping through in verses like Genesis 1 verse 26, where God seems to be conferring with other divine figures. The Bible presents itself as monotheistic, but there are traces, little fingerprints if you will, of a more complex divine hierarchy. The USK in Genesis could be a nod to a time when the ancient Israelites hadn't yet stripped their religion of its polytheistic past. And here's another layer to this. Why does it even matter that the Bible retains these hints of a divine council? Because it means Genesis isn't just unique revelation. It's a product of its time and place, a reflection of the surrounding cultures that influenced it. Babylon had its divine council. So did Egypt, so did Canaan, and so apparently did early Israel. Over time, the theology shifted, but the storytelling structure, creation as a divine collaboration, stuck around in small, fascinating ways. So here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the role of humanity in these ancient creation stories. In both Genesis and Enuma Elish, humans get created near the end, but the purpose behind their creation. That's where things take a sharp turn, and what it reveals about how the ancient Sora place in the universe might not be what you expect. In Enuma Elish, humanity was created for one reason: to serve the gods. That's right. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and establishes cosmic order, the gods realize they still need to eat, drink, and live their divine lives without lifting a finger. So what's the solution? Humans. They make people out of the blood of a defeated god, Kingu, and assign them the task of doing all the hard labor. The purpose of human existence, according to the Babylonian myth, is to take the workload off the gods' hands. Humans are nothing but cosmic servants, created to be slaves for divine beings who can't be bothered to take care of themselves. Now let's flip the script to Genesis. In Genesis 2, humans are also created from the earth, just dirt and breath, nothing too flashy. But instead of being slaves to a pantheon of lazy gods, humans are given a different role. They're placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. They are not servants in the same sense, but there's still a clear division of labor. Adam and Eve aren't kings of the garden, they're more like stewards, expected to tend the land on God's behalf. So, while the Genesis account puts a nicer spin on it, humans still have a job to do. Genesis gives humanity something Enuma Elish doesn't: dignity. In Genesis 1 verse 26, humans are said to be created in the image of God. That's a bold statement. It means we're not just here to work the land, we're reflections of the divine. This is a huge theological shift from Babylonian thinking. Instead of being slaves created to serve the gods' needs, humans in Genesis have a unique, elevated status. They're meant to represent God on earth, to rule over the animals, to shape creation in partnership with the divine. But before you get too comfortable with the Genesis version, let's ask the uncomfortable question: is this really freedom? Sure, we're not mixing drinks for Marduk and his buddies, but we're still bound by divine expectation. We might be created in the image of God, but that comes with responsibilities and consequences. The minute Adam and Eve step out of line, they're kicked out of Eden, destined to toil and struggle for the rest of their lives. Is that so different from being a servant? Babylonian culture was deeply hierarchical. Gods at the top, kings as their representatives, and everyone else below, toiling away. So it makes sense that their myth portrays humanity as servants. The biblical version, while more egalitarian on the surface, still reinforces a divine human hierarchy. Even though humans are made in God's image, they're still expected to serve, obey, and follow the rules or suffer the consequences. What if both these stories are just two sides of the same coin? Whether we're seen as divine laborers or stewards of creation, both myths make it clear humanity is not in charge. We're subject to forces beyond our control, whether they're represented by gods or a singular god. And maybe that's the point. Both Babylonian and Israelite societies use these myths to remind people of their place in the grand scheme of things. You're here for a reason, but don't get too comfortable. You're still under orders. Now we're getting into the real crux of the difference between Babylonian mythology and the Bible, how the divine operates in the act of creation. In Babylon, the gods are constantly in competition, chaos, conflict, and compromise. Marduk doesn't rise to the top without a fight. He's got to prove himself, battle Tiamat, get the approval of other gods, and finally, after all the drama, he can start creating the world. It's a divine struggle for control, and creation is a byproduct of that chaos. But when you shift to Genesis, the story takes on an entirely different tone. There's no council of gods, no violent overthrow of cosmic forces. In the Bible, creation is the work of one God. And not just any God, a God who doesn't need to negotiate with anyone. There's no struggle, no approval needed. Genesis presents a God whose word is law. He speaks, and it happens. Let there be light, and suddenly there's light. Creation unfolds not from conflict, but from authority. That's the genius of the Genesis account. It completely strips away the drama of divine politics. There's no cosmic war. Yahweh doesn't need to fight for dominance. There's no Tiamat to slay, no divine counsel to please. In Genesis, God operates solo, exercising absolute sovereignty. It's monotheism in its purest form, one God, total control, no competition. But this raises an intriguing question. Why such a stark difference? Why is the Babylonian pantheon full of competing gods while Genesis insists on a single, uncontested deity? Well, look at the cultural context. The Babylonian Empire was a massive multi-god society, and their creation story reflected the political realities of their world. Power was always in flux, always up for grabs. Their gods mirrored that, with Marduk needing to fight to secure his place. Babylon's creation myth was an allegory for power struggles, both divine and earthly. Israel, however, was crafting a radically different worldview. The Israelites were surrounded by nations with multiple gods, and they needed to distinguish themselves not just religiously but politically. Their story wasn't just about explaining the origins of the universe, it was a declaration of monotheistic supremacy. Genesis was a theological rebellion against the polytheistic empires around them. The message was simple but powerful. Our God doesn't compete. Our God doesn't need to fight. Our God is the only God. Even though Genesis pushes this monotheistic agenda, you can still find traces of an older, more complex view of the divine in the Bible. In some ancient Hebrew traditions, God wasn't always portrayed as the sole deity in charge. The idea of Yahweh as one God among many was part of early Israelite religion before it evolved into full-blown monotheism. Genesis represents the final version, the cleaned-up, authoritative narrative, but underneath it, there are remnants of that older, messier belief system. So when you read Genesis, you are not just reading a creation story. You're reading a shift in religious thought, a shift from a world of many gods to one in which Yahweh reigns supreme. It's the moment where Israel makes its boldest claim, our God is the only God, and he doesn't need to battle for control, he already has it. What's more, this transition wasn't just theological, it was also political. The Israelites were carving out their own identity in a world dominated by superpowers like Egypt and Babylon. Genesis wasn't just about how the world was made, it was about who had the right to define it. It was about power, authority, and asserting a monotheistic vision in a world full of rival gods. So while the Babylonians told stories of gods battling for dominance, Genesis gives us a God who is beyond competition, a God whose very speech creates reality. It's an audacious claim, and one that shaped the foundation of Western religious thought for millennia. Let's wrap this up by pulling back the curtain on the Bible itself. We've been diving in Enuma Elish, Genesis, and their similarities, but the big question is, what does this all mean for the Bible we know today? If Genesis isn't as original as we thought, does that change how we view it? The Bible has always been seen by millions as a unique, divinely inspired text, standing apart from anything else in human history. But here's the reality: the Bible, particularly Genesis, didn't appear in a vacuum. It was born in a world full of competing myths, legends, and theologies. And these stories, like Enuma Elish, left their mark. Whether through cultural contact, shared storytelling traditions, or the direct influence of Babylonian myth on the Israelites during their exile, the connections are undeniable. Genesis and the Bible at large don't try to erase the past. They incorporate it, transform it, and reframe it to fit a new theological vision. In a sense, the Bible is a remix. It takes the raw material of ancient Near Eastern myth and spins it into a narrative that supports a revolutionary claim that there is only one God, that this God controls all things, and that humanity was created not as slaves but as reflections of the divine. The Bible isn't just a religious text, it's a record of human history, human culture, and human thought. It carries within it layers of ancient beliefs, some of which are hidden in plain sight. As we've explored today, the Genesis creation story, for all its power and influence, is just one chapter in the larger story of humanity's quest to understand the universe. Now, what does that mean for your faith? For your understanding of Scripture? That's up to you, but what's clear is that the Bible is more complex, more connected to the world around it, than most people realize. It's a living document, shaped by centuries of cultural interaction, theological evolution, and yes, even the myths of empires long gone. This isn't about undermining the Bible. Far from it. It's about recognizing the richness, the depth, and the human story behind it. The Bible is a product of the ancient world, influenced by the very myths we've been discussing. It's not a standalone book, it's part of the grand tapestry of human history. And that makes it even more fascinating. And in that sense, the Bible is as much a historical artifact as it is a spiritual guide. Thank you so much for watching this video and sticking with us through these deep, thought-provoking ideas. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about these connections between the Bible and Babylonian myth? Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. God bless you all, and see you next time.